You're watching BreakThru News.
I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and you're watching BreakThru News on BTR Today. On today's show, we're talking about being a 20-something traveler, namely traveling for cheap. Joining me to discuss is Jess Goulart, and host of the podcast 20-something-traveler, or TST, that's launching next week, and Joel Church, Washington, D.C.-based writer and artist, and all-round D.C. city expert, and Joel is actually Jess's first guest on TST. So thank you, both of you, for joining me.
Hey, thank you.
So, Jess, you're launching this podcast, 20-something Traveler. Why did you decide to start this? What's behind this?
So, basically, I have always loved traveling, and it's pretty much the reason that my bank account is constantly in such peril. And I've spent a lot of times overseas, and one of the things that I noticed recently when I was traveling in Europe is that all of the big destination spots are so flooded with tourists these days that it's really hard to have like an authentic experience when you're traveling abroad. And it's really difficult to know, like what local spots you should check out, what you should be doing. And in addition to that, it's so expensive now to travel through Europe, particularly to the big cities, Paris, Rome. Those places will cost you a fortune, and I think that really dissuades a lot of young people from traveling, and that's unfortunate because it really shouldn't. You can do it for cheap, so I thought I would create a podcast that takes care of both of those issues, gets a local to sort of curate content in a destination for us, and also tells us how to travel on the cheap.
So, Joel, you are Jess's local expert for Washington, D.C. On the first upcoming episode. Do you think nowadays, kind of what Jess is alluding to, do you think nowadays travel is all about not being a tourist? And also, as Jess mentioned, a lot of these tourist traps are expensive and overpriced?
Yeah, I do to a fair extent. I mean, it's really easy to It's actually not that expensive to do those things if you want to in DC. All the museums are free, and I grew up here, so it was always, whenever I go to another city and I have to pay to get into a museum, I'm just like, what's going on? I'm getting fleeced here. But yeah, I think people are definitely all about not going to the major things like the White House or say like, I know a lot of people our age I think are. A couple friends of mine went to London recently, and they were saying how they didn't want to go. Right, yeah. I mean, they didn't want to go to the London Eye because they thought it would just be kind of cheesy and tourist and overexpensive, and just, I think it's definitely gone for a more authentic feel. So I absolutely agree with Jess.
Jess, why do you think it's important to travel in your 20s? Because I feel like a lot of people will say, of course I want to travel, but just not now, it's too expensive, or I'm working on my career. Do you think it's specifically important to travel now and not put it off?
I do, for a few reasons. The first one is that your life is going to get really complicated really quickly, and I say that from experience. When you first graduate from college, you have all of these possibilities open to you and a real freedom that as you get older starts to disappear a little bit, and not in a bad way, just because you start having real responsibilities and obligations that you have to fulfill and meet, and that makes just picking up and going difficult. So take advantage of your 20s when you maybe don't have all of those responsibilities quite yet. And also, I don't know if anybody watching has ever slept in a hostel with like 40 people, but I have. And that is an experience you want to have in your 20s and not so much in your 30s when you're like, man, this bed is super uncomfortable and I'm in a room with 40 other people and I really am not loving this experience.
Right, those life experiences will actually probably be more fun in your 20s and not as fun later on. That makes sense.
Not as fun when you're in your 30s. I don't think,
Especially if you happen to have kids running around, definitely not as fun. But Joel, you mentioned earlier, the White House is obviously going to be flooded with tourists. Surely there are some very touristy spots like the White House that someone should still go to when they're visiting a place. So how do you distinguish between the touristy landmarks that are worth visiting and those that aren't? Or would you just tell someone just stay away from the crowds no matter what?
I would probably say to maybe stay off the mall a little bit. That just tends to be like really super crowded, and just sort of, stick to downtown. And DC is, it's really interesting because we're basically a city of all small towns. Like all the neighborhoods are just, small little towns where people know each other and they're really friendly. And you can do a lot of things, and there's a lot of flavor, that happens in each neighborhood that you can't get somewhere else. So, yeah, I'd say stick with the neighborhoods, and then, definitely go see the Capitol because it's just so awe-inspiring and it looks like a painting when you look at it. So, yeah.
Jess, when you're thinking about a segment for TST, what do you think? What do you look for in a city or a region? Because obviously there are almost infinite possibilities, for going anywhere in the world. So how do you go about choosing what to focus on?
I have a couple ways of picking the destinations. The first one is I look at the top 10 and 20 lists from really popular publications that 20-somethings are going to be familiar with, like Huffington Post. And I also check the New York Times top 10 destinations to travel to, and sort of curate down my own list based on all of those suggestions. And then the other thing I do is ask my friends who are 20-something travelers and the staff at BTR, and think about it myself. Where have I heard people talking about? Where do I want to go? And then it's an extra bonus for me if I actually get to travel to places that I've curated. I'll know what to do.
Where do you want to go right now? What's top on your list?
Right now, I really want to go to either Japan or the Philippines. And if I go to the Philippines, I want to do something called deep rock soloing, which is where you boulder up these huge, like, crazy boulders that are jutting out over the ocean. And you boulder is climbing without a rope, so when you fall,
oh my God,
fall into the ocean, it's super cool. So those are my top two right now.
Wow, that sounds really intense. We're going to take a break in 1 second, but before we do, I just want to ask Joel, how do you spot a tourist in DC? How obvious is it?
Fanny packs.
Okay. That's it. That's all there is to it. If they're wearing a fanny pack, they're a tourist, and if they're not...
And if they stand on the left side of the escalator.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting. Well, we are going to take a break. We'll be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from a special episode of Live Studio featuring High Waisted. We're back with our discussion on traveling. Joel, what do you think makes for a great city to visit? What should you look for? I'm sure DC has quite a lot of city pride, and a lot of other cities do.
Absolutely.
Is that important?
Absolutely. I say, like a lot of city pride, friendly people is always a plus. Just, a lot of culture and good restaurants and bars and, just wonderful things to see.
Mm. Jess, I noticed that your upcoming list of segments, that there is a balance between destinations at home and abroad. Is that something you think is important? Because I'm sure a lot of people automatically dream of traveling the world, which obviously makes sense. It's very exotic and exciting. But do you think sometimes you overlook places closer to home that could be really interesting?
I do think that, and I'm also totally guilty of that. I live in New York City. There are quite literally like hundreds of cool cities at my doorstep that are just a few hours away, DC included, and I really don't make good enough use of what's locally accessible to me, which is actually why I picked DC as the first city, because BTR has such a strong audience in New York, and I really think that it's important to not only dream of traveling overseas, but also see what's just in your backyard.
Joel, I know that you said you grew up in DC, so obviously you'll be familiar with it, but do you still feel like you've needed to make an effort to get to know DC on a deeper level? Because I know I grew up in London, and I probably don't actually know as much as someone who visits London because I just stay in my own neighborhood. So do you make an effort to get to know your city better?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of really good just local blogs that, handle, like, each neighborhood will have, like 5 or 6 blogs, and they'll say, like, oh, this is opening up next week, you should check it out, this is what they're going to have. Like, there's a new sort of authentic Peruvian restaurant that just opened up about a mile from me, and it looks fantastic, and normally I wouldn't have known about it. But, it's a good way to, explore different places and get to know.
Jess, what about traveling alone versus traveling with others? What would be your priority, or what are the perks of either one?
So I have done both of those, and obviously if you're traveling alone, safety is huge, especially for women. Unfortunately, you do have to be extra careful, and sometimes that boils down to just knowing when to cross the street. And I think that as long as you're being safe and smart, traveling alone can be really fun. It can also, as you might imagine, get lonely quick. So when I travel alone, I really try to make use of the hostels that I stay in. Hostels will often host really fantastic meet and greets, and they'll organize outings and bar crawls. I try to do a lot of that because the quicker you can make friends, and the better you're going to feel about traveling alone. Traveling with a group, you already have your friends there. That's nice and easy, but sometimes there's a little bit of tension because one person wants to do one thing that day, another wants to see something else. So either one is awesome and hard for their own different reasons.
And in terms of making those decisions with friends, it probably, there's no such thing as like the perfect visit. You're not going to get everything in. It's more about just finding some good experiences to take home with you.
I actually was talking to my roommate earlier, and she was like, yeah, I was traveling with a boyfriend once, and I lost a coin toss, and so we didn't get to go to the Cinque Terre that day. We went to Venice instead. And I was like, bummer. And she was like, I mean, bummer, yes, but not really, because I'm still in Venice. So it's
Well, we're about to break. Before we do, and before I ask Joel for his top tip in DC, Joel, I'm just wondering, are you not a little bit worried about sharing these secrets with visitors? Is there not a risk in ruining these places, or I'm sure you still keep a lot of tricks up your sleeve that you're not going to share with anyone?
Oh, of course. There are definitely some places that, no, I don't want to say anything about. But that's actually more for the locals, I'd say, than visitors. I'm absolutely fine with them going places because they probably don't know too many locals anyway. But it's sort of when the bros get involved that places can get kind of ruined.
Well, and I guess the visitors are only going to go there once, and the locals might crowd it forever. So I guess
absolutely.
That makes sense. So what would be your top tip right now for DC?
Tip? Stay out of Chinatown, I'd say, because that's where the sort of like DC version of the bridge and tunnel ends up going, and it's just very commercial and just sort of, I don't know, I'd stay away from there.
Cool. Well, to catch the rest of Joel's suggestions for seeing DC from a local's perspective, tune in this Monday at noon to Jess's first podcast episode on 20-something-traveler. Thank you very much, Jess and Joel, for joining me. We'll be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from our most recent edition to Serious Business on BTR TV featuring robot death kites. Thank you, Jess and Joel, for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and this is Breakthrough News, your window into today. Be sure to check out breakthroughradio.com through the weekend for our continued AHA Week coverage to read about which public policies are actually making a difference for planet Earth. That's it for what's breaking through the news today. Tell us what's breaking through your world on Twitter @Breakthrough Radio. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and thank you for joining us.